On a September Sunday in 1408, a wedding took place at the stone church of Valsey in Greenland. It was a joyful, ordinary ceremony by all accounts. No hint of hardship or looming disaster was mentioned in the letters that recorded the event. Yet that wedding would go down in history as the last anyone heard from Greenland's Norse colony. After nearly 400 years on the island's remote shores, the Norse settlers seemingly vanished from the historical record without explanation. When European missionaries returned to Greenland in the 18th century, they found only ruins, great stone halls, abandoned farms, and crumbling churches, but no people. The fate of these settlers at the edge of the medieval world remains one of history's great unsolved mysteries. The Norse presence in Greenland began around 985 AD, when Eric the Red, an exiled Icelander notorious for his fiery temper, set sail westward and stumbled upon a frigid new land. In an effort to attract colonists to this new landscape, he massaged the truth and dubbed it Greenland, hinting at fertile meadows he found in the southern fjords. In reality, despite the misleadingly pleasant name, most of Greenland is blanketed by an ice sheet and was uninhabitable. The Norse established two settlements along Greenland's southwest, a larger eastern settlement near the island's southern tip, and a smaller western settlement roughly 240 miles to the north. At their peak, perhaps 2,500 Norse lived in Greenland, clustered on hundreds of farmsteads around a dozen small churches. These settlers brought along sheep, goats, and cattle, and tried to recreate a European farming life on Greenland. They hunted seals and caribou, and their ships carried Arctic goods to trade in Europe. Walrus tusks in particular were a lifeline, and this prized ivory was exchanged for iron, timber, and other supplies the Greenlanders lacked. For several centuries, the Greenlanders managed to sustain their fragile colony. They built churches and farmsteads, and even imported luxuries like stained glass for chapel windows. For a time, they survived through ingenuity and determination. The Greenland outpost even served as a base for further exploration, and Eric the Red's son, the famous explorer Leif Erikson, sailed from Greenland to North America around 1000. But by the 1300s, the colony showed ominous signs of decline. The western settlement was the first to falter, likely being abandoned around 1350. The eastern settlement lasted a bit longer. The final written report from Greenland was that Valsey church wedding of 1408, and after that, nothing more remained. By around 1450, archaeological evidence indicates the eastern settlement too was deserted. Given that Greenland was totally out of the way, this disappearance went unnoticed for literal centuries. When a group of Danish missionaries arrived in 1721, they found only ruins and animal bones, but no surviving Norse people. Lacking written accounts of disaster, researchers have turned to physical clues. Trash heaps at Norse sites reveal a gradual shift. Later layers hold many seal bones and few cow or sheep bones, signaling a diet increasingly reliant on marine food. Chemical analysis of Norse skeletons confirms that by the 14th century, up to 80% of their diet came from the sea, mostly seal, a huge jump from earlier times. This suggests they were adapting to failing crops and shrinking herds. Even so, their society was in decline. Eventually, even the farms and churches were abandoned. We don't know if the last Greenlanders died out or chose to leave voluntarily, only that by 1500 at the latest, they were gone. A leading explanation for the colony's disappearance is natural climate change, specifically the onset of the Little Ice Age. The Norse initially benefited from the medieval warm period running from about 900 to 1300, which provided milder weather for grazing and plentiful seas. After about 1250, however, the climate began to slowly turn. Winters grew longer and colder, and summers grew shorter and less intense. While this effect was felt in other parts of the world, it's thought to have had a particularly outsized impact on the Norse in Greenland, who were trying to replicate a European lifestyle. As temperatures dropped, less hay could be grown and sea ice clogged the coasts. Repeated harsh winters would have caused fodder shortages, starving the Norse's livestock and setting the stage for famine. Climate challenges went beyond the cold as well. Sediment studies suggest a prolonged drought struck southern Greenland in the 1300s and 1400s, making it hard to grow enough hay for winter. They were also struck by rising sea levels, and archaeological evidence shows that Norse settlements moved further away from the coast as time went on. In short, the Norse faced a perfect storm of environmental stress: colder climate, drought, and encroaching seas, all of which undermined their survival. This mix of factors is compelling, though climate alone may not explain everything. After all, the Inuit, who were also present on the island, survived these changes. However, they lived a very different lifestyle. Another factor was the collapse of trade and the colony's isolation from Europe. Greenland depended on Norway for supplies like iron and lumber, paid for with local products such as walrus ivory. For centuries, walrus tusks were a major export. But as time went on, the European market for walrus ivory crashed when higher quality African elephant ivory became available. Suddenly, the Greenlanders had little of value to trade for essentials. In the mid-14th century, Europe was plagued by the Black Death, which compounded these woes by devastating Norway and other trading partners. Norway's capacity to send ships to Greenland essentially collapsed. It's unknown if the plague reached Greenland, but the effect was that the colony became cut off. Fewer supply ships meant no new goods or new settlers, leaving the Greenland Norse to fend for themselves. This extreme isolation meant that when the climate turned against them and the flow of resources dried up, they had no lifeline. The trade collapse and isolation weren't likely the sole cause of the colony's end, but they greatly weakened its resilience and contributed to the crisis. Another possible piece of the puzzle is the Norse interaction with the indigenous Inuit people who arrived in Greenland during the 1200s. Norse accounts mention a few skirmishes with the Inuit, whom they called Skraelings, and Norse artifacts have turned up at Inuit sites, indicating some contact. It has been suggested that competition or conflict with the Inuit may have hastened the Norse decline. That said, there is little hard evidence of sustained violence. Beyond those couple of skirmishes, neither archaeology nor Inuit oral history shows signs of a civilization clash between the two groups. Historians believe it's likely the Norse and Inuit mostly kept to separate regions of Greenland. They likely traded at times, and presumably maintained a mutual level of distrust. So while occasional clashes or competition might have added to the Norse settlers' troubles, conflict with the Inuit alone doesn't seem to explain their disappearance. At most, it was another challenge that made survival more difficult. The final mystery is just what happened to these Norse people in their final days. There are hints that a group of survivors might have tried to sail away, perhaps back to Iceland or Norway, or even westward to North America. If any did, no record of their successful arrival exists. Such refugees may have perished at sea or simply left no trace. Some historians have even suggested that a few Norse may have assimilated into the Inuit population, though the genetic data is currently lacking. For now, the disappearance of the Norse in Greenland remains an enduring historical mystery. The consensus for the time being is that it was likely a combination of many factors that overwhelmed their colonies on the edge of the European world. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to click that like button, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. Also, don't forget to check out my other channels, my podcast, and more by clicking the links in the description. There's a significant amount of misunderstanding about the diet of medieval people, with peasants often being depicted as constantly on the verge of starvation. In this segment, we're going to separate the wheat from the chaff when it comes to the medieval peasant diet in England. Medieval English peasants didn't survive on gruel alone. In fact, their daily fare was more varied and substantial than popular myths suggest. For the vast majority of English peasants, bread was the cornerstone of the diet. Historical records indicate a typical peasant consumed around 2 to 3 pounds of bread per day, similar in quantity to what the nobility ate. This bread was usually coarse and dark, and made from cheaper grains like rye, barley, or oats, rather than fine white wheat. In fact, the color and texture of bread served as a class marker. The darker and heavier the loaf, the lower the status of its eater. Peasants often had to bake with what was available, mixing rye or barley with legumes to stretch flour supplies. Wheat bread, the light, refined kind, was a rarity for them, since wheat was a cash crop usually reserved for paying rents or supplying the lord's household. To accompany all that bread, the typical peasant meal featured pottage, a thick soup or stew. Pottage wasn't a single recipe, but rather a catch-all term for a one-pot meal of boiling grains, vegetables, and whatever else was on hand. A basic pottage might include chopped onions, root vegetables like turnips or carrots, leafy greens and beans, all simmered together. If available, a bit of meat or fish could be added to enrich the flavor. Bits of pork were especially common, as many peasants kept a pig or two and used every part of the animal. Salted bacon could flavor a pot of vegetables, and even blood was used in dishes like black pudding. Dairy products also featured in peasant diets and used milk or whey in cooking when they could. Eggs from chickens kept in the yard provided additional protein and were a regular part of meals throughout the year. Ale was the standard drink for medieval peasants in England, as clean water wasn't always available. Even when clean water was available, peasants often preferred fermented drinks, since they were perceived as being much safer than water. And they weren't exactly wrong. Peasants brewed ale from barley and other grains, producing a mildly alcoholic porridge-like beverage that was nutritious and safer than many water sources. This was essentially a liquid bread rather than a modern drink, and the calories from ale helped peasants work. It was common for people of all ages to drink weak ale daily, and quantities consumed could be impressive by modern standards. Contemporary accounts across Europe suggest peasants might drink anywhere from 2 to 4 liters of beer a day. That said, it's important to remember that these drinks were extremely weak in terms of alcoholic content. Unlike in other parts of Europe, medieval English peasants rarely, if ever, drank wine, unless they were particularly wealthy members of the class, or for one exception I'll discuss in a bit. Also, to tip my hand a bit, that exception wasn't typically communion wine, which due to scarcity wasn't widely used in England during the time period. Forage foods also played a big part of their diet throughout the warmer seasons. Gathering seasonal wild berries, nuts, and fruit helped supplement the diet of your average medieval English peasant. Winter meals were necessarily the most monotonous. The need to bridge this seasonal gap drove peasants to become skilled in preservation techniques and communal storage, which shaped their eating habits significantly. Fresh produce was scarce, with cabbages and root vegetables being the main fresh plants that could endure winter storage. Thus, winter pottage might lean heavily on dried beans and peas, root crops, and preserved ingredients. Salted pork or smoked bacon might be added sparingly to stews for fat and flavor. Likewise, salted or dried fish was common in winter, especially as meat was off limits on many religious fast days. On the whole, English peasants shared a broadly similar diet base, but the specifics could be enriched or narrowed by where they lived and how much they earned. A sheep farming village would necessarily consume more mutton and dairy. A woodland village, on the other hand, could add significantly more foraged nuts, berries, and the occasional poached game animal. Since the medieval period is long, it's important to remember that economic conditions for English peasants weren't the same throughout. In what might seem to be a counterintuitive twist at first glance, English peasants are thought to have eaten best in the wake of the Black Plague. During this period, labor was scarce and wages rose, so surviving peasants could afford better food, including much more meat. There's a popular image of medieval English peasants living on the brink of starvation. While medieval life certainly had its hardships, the idea that peasants ate only bland, inferior food in a desperate attempt to survive the day is a stereotype not supported by the evidence. In reality, during normal years, peasants generally had enough calories from their grain-heavy diet. Starvation occurred in times of famine, which were terrible when they hit, but weren't perpetual by any means. In good times, medieval English peasants ate until they were full, even if the diet was simple, and as I'll get to shortly, peasants occasionally got to really pig out as well. Another idea is that peasants essentially never ate meat, and that meat was reserved for the nobility. While it's true meat was rarer and considered a luxury, peasants did eat meat occasionally. They raised pigs and chickens that could be slaughtered, and sometimes had mutton from aging sheep. It's important to remember that feudal lords and peasants often maintained quite cordial and positive relationships. Lords would occasionally give peasants a share of hunted deer to show their generosity to their subjects. When lords weren't willingly sharing their wild animals, poachers stepped up their game, especially in densely forested areas. Peasants also ate fish quite often, especially on church-mandated meatless days. Common fish weren't an elite food, and cheaper fish like herring or locally caught eels were common peasant fare, depending on how close they lived to a body of water. However, when it comes to consumption of meat by English peasants, there are areas of uncertainty. We know meat was occasional, but quantifying just how rare it was is hard, and this of course depends on the time period. Some evidence suggests that before the Black Death, lower class diets were very heavy in bread and porridge with quite minimal animal protein. After the peasant population thinned, meat and cheese became more common for ordinary people as peasants became wealthier. It's also important to remember that the church calendar also provided numerous feast days, which, though spiritually focused, often became occasions for eating better than usual. Saints' days, Christmas, Easter, and weddings or village festivals were times when peasants might get a break and a very hearty meal, sometimes full of rare delights depending on the host. English lords were generally expected to host large feasts for their tenants. This was a chance both to show their generosity and grandeur, and also continue to win the favor of the people they ruled. Notably, these sorts of events may have been the only opportunity for an average peasant to taste a cup of wine or a truly delicious roast. By examining what medieval English peasants ate and drank, we can gain insight into the people who formed the majority of the population. From this, we can learn that while peasants definitely didn't have it easy, they didn't spend their miserable lives starving between servings of gruel. Modern pop culture has firmly embedded the idea of the Thieves' Guild in the public imagination. Fantasy novels and video games frequently portray a formal guild of thieves, a structured, almost professional association of criminals akin to the craft guilds of old. Such portrayals have led many fans to wonder if these criminal guilds existed in history, assuming that the prevalence of the trope hints at a historical reality. Long before modern video games glamorized thieves' guilds, writers of the early modern period were already playing with the idea as a tongue-in-cheek fiction. A standout example comes from 1613, when Miguel de Cervantes, better known as the author of Don Quixote, published a short story called Rinconete y Cortadillo. In this comedic tale, set in Cervantes' own time, two young petty thieves arrive in Seville only to stumble into the city's well-organized guild of thieves. These two ragamuffins think they can just start stealing and profiting. But nope, they're wrong. There's a bureaucracy they've got to deal with. Cervantes presents Seville's underworld as if it were governed by a formal thieves' guild modeled on a craft guild. The head of this criminal organization is the colorful chief thief, Monipodio, who presides over a den of rogues as their guild master. Cervantes' protagonists quickly learn that they can't pick pockets in Seville without registering with Monopodio's guild. To a reader at the time, this would have reflected the guilds that dominated Spanish cities, ensuring every profession was regulated. Inside Cervantes' fictional guild, the parody continues. Monopodio's band of cut-purses and swindlers use guild terminology: apprentices, masters, secret passwords, and a ledger of misdeeds. Thieves attend their own special church to pray for success in their illicit endeavors. The narrative highlights how every thief must learn the ropes as an apprentice and eventually become a master thief, just as if he were rising through the ranks of a lawful craft. For Cervantes' audience, the notion of thieves enforcing guild rules would have been delightfully absurd. It was a clever satire of the overly regulated guild culture of Spain, which he implicitly viewed as restraining economic growth. By depicting the underworld as meticulously organized as the official economy, Cervantes was not suggesting such a guild actually existed. Rather, he was using irony to comment on society. In fact, the story likely resonated because everyone knew thieves didn't have an actual guild. Thus, the absurdity derived from treating crime as a legitimate unionized profession, like tailors or blacksmiths, with all the civic privileges a guild had in a town or city. Interestingly, while this work was understood by everyone as a clever satire, some have argued there may be some historical precedent for real thieves' guilds. For instance, the Egyptian city of Cairo, while under Ottoman rule, had an organization that is often likened to a real-life thieves' guild. However, unlike a real guild, which is designed to regulate a craft, this organization was something slightly different. All evidence indicates that it was actually an organization where thieves could fence their items. This was thus more like a well-entrenched organized crime syndicate than an actual guild, since unlike an actual guild, there was no civic privileges to go along with it. The Cairo authorities weren't being petitioned by the Thieves Guild to shut down unlicensed pickpockets or fences. Even if the organization was able to hold significant sway over city officials and exercise power from the shadows, this simply makes it a criminal syndicate, not a guild. In fact, most instances of so-called historical thieves' guilds are just simply organized crime groups operating in a region. The idea of a thieves' guild, popularized by fantasy fiction and video games, doesn't hold up historically because it misunderstands what a guild actually was. Real medieval guilds were legal regulated associations of craftsmen or merchants formed to protect economic interests, set standards, and support members. They were recognized by local authorities and often integrated into civic structures. Thieves, by contrast, operated outside the law and couldn't organize openly without attracting immediate suppression. Criminal networks certainly existed, but they were secretive, fragmented, and often lacked the hierarchical structure or mutual protection typical of legitimate guilds. This is one of the reasons why Cervantes' satire was so hilarious to readers at the time. Thieves, by definition, couldn't be a guild, because the organization into a guild requires officially backed legitimacy. In short, a thieves' guild is a fiction that misrepresents both criminal reality and medieval institutions. While they may be fiction, given how ubiquitous they've become, it's quite clear that the trope resonates heavily with readers and gamers. In the late 15th century, a quiet convent in Germany became the unlikely epicenter of a bizarre outbreak. It began with a single nun who, without apparent reason, felt an irresistible urge to bite her fellow sisters. This nun lunged and bit one companion after another, and before long the strange impulse had spread. Soon every nun in that convent was caught up in a frenzy of biting. The contagion didn't stop at the convent's walls. As word of the biting nuns spread through the region, other nuns in other convents began exhibiting the same startling behavior, almost as if the very idea were infectious. According to later accounts, news of the initial incident passed throughout Germany, before working its way into other regions. From there, the biting mania then jumped to neighboring countries, even reaching as far away as Rome. In the superstitious climate of the late Middle Ages, the immediate assumption was often supernatural. Many concluded that the nuns must have been possessed by demons or some sort of spiritual affliction. Priests reasoned that if the cause was not an obvious physical illness, it had to be the work of the devil and his minions. The convents convened special prayers and masses, imploring divine help for the afflicted sisters. When prayer alone failed to calm the biting frenzy, the church escalated to exorcisms. These formal rituals were intended to cast out evil spirits that they believed were prompting the nuns to behave like wild animals. These religious remedies, however, had no effect on the outbreak. According to much later tellings, the attempts to exorcise the so-called demons only made matters worse by intensifying the nuns' own fear. Hearing that the devil might be loose among them sent the most impressionable sisters into panic, so that they too felt the urge to bite. In essence, the very belief that they were bewitched helped the contagion spread even faster. With exorcisms failing and the biting epidemic only growing, the secular authorities decided to intervene with more direct measures. Local officials and physicians were called in to stop the madness before it spread further. They abandoned any supernatural explanation and addressed the situation in the most literal way possible. The nuns were firmly told that there was nothing demonic happening, and that the compulsion to bite was not a curse, but a figment of their own imagination. What could have caused such an outbreak in the first place? With the benefit of hindsight, modern scholars classify the biting nuns episode as a classic case of mass hysteria, or what today might be termed mass psychogenic illness. In essence, this means there was no physical pathogen. It was a psychological phenomenon in which mental stress and suggestion led to real physical actions. Mass hysterias tend to occur in places where tightly bound groups of people live under pressure, and medieval convents fit the bill exactly. At that time, many young women were forced by their families to enter convent life. Once inside, they had to endure an austere existence that demanded constant obedience, poverty, and long hours of labor and study. These nuns lived cloistered from the world, in what were essentially communal, high-stress conditions, not of their own choosing. It's not hard to imagine the psychological strain this could create on these women. Frustrations and fears would build up in such an environment, even if unspoken. We know today that such pent-up stress can sometimes find unusual outlets. In the terminology of modern psychology, the nuns may have been experiencing a conversion disorder. This is when an emotional or psychological conflict is unconsciously converted into unusual physical behavior, in this case, compulsive biting. But here, there's also the element of mass psychogenic illness, indicating that this spread throughout these very tight-knit and isolated communities. Notably, in an interesting twist, there is a further mystery associated with the biting nuns that isn't often discussed. It's very possible the story of the biting nuns was exaggerated or even invented. There's no solid contemporary evidence, no surviving convent records, and most accounts come from much later writers who summarize sources that are now lost to us. That said, the main source which is cited for the biting nuns case is Justus Hecker, a highly respected 19th century German physician. Given his stellar reputation, historians of medicine generally believe that he was legitimately working with sources that are now simply lost in the two intervening centuries. In the early 2nd century AD, the city of Rome was a sprawling metropolis, and likely the largest city in the world at the time. Historians estimate over 1 million people lived in Rome by the 2nd century. Of these, a significant fraction were enslaved people, perhaps on the order of 1/3 of the population. The remainder were free residents, which in Rome during this time mostly meant Roman citizens. Thus, hundreds of thousands of citizens called Rome home in 100 AD. The question is, how many of those citizens were actually working for a living? To modern eyes, we might assume most able-bodied urban dwellers would be employed. However, ancient Rome's economy and society were very different from ours. A large class of the population, the enslaved laborers previously mentioned, performed the bulk of manual work, and even many skilled jobs. Meanwhile, many free citizens survived without steady jobs, supported by slave labor, public welfare, and the vast wealth of the empire. The result was that a surprisingly large percentage of Roman citizens did not work in the sense of holding a regular occupation. Contemporary writers and modern historians alike have noted that Rome became a city of parasitic consumers living off the spoils of empire. To analyze this, we need to look at who among Rome's citizens did work, what jobs were available, and how others managed to get by without work. One major reason for low employment among Roman citizens was the institution of slavery. Enslaved people in Rome held jobs across the board. They weren't only domestic servants or gladiators or laborers, they also served as teachers, scribes, physicians, artisans, and more. Further, virtually any menial labor or basic service could be done by a slave. Wealthy households had slaves for cooking, cleaning, and tutoring children. Even many professions that would be well paid today, like teachers and doctors, were often occupied by highly educated Greek slaves in Roman times. This meant fewer openings for free citizens to find work. In addition, a large segment of working Romans were freedmen, former slaves who had been freed by their masters and who became citizens upon gaining freedom. Freedmen often remained in the city and put their skills to use in trades and businesses. In fact, evidence from tomb inscriptions indicates that the working economy of Rome was dominated by people of servile origin. Over 60% of inscriptions that mention an occupation in the city were commissioned by freedmen or even slaves, proudly recording their trades and achievements. These freedmen worked as bakers, carpenters, fishmongers, shopkeepers, leather workers. Basically, they formed the backbone of Rome's artisan and retail class. Further, even though they were now technically free, they still had obligations towards their former owners, who were then called their patrons. A poor freeborn citizen would find himself competing with skilled ex-slaves for jobs in every craft and service sector. For the lowest class free citizens, opportunities to earn a wage were limited. Some picked up work as casual laborers, for example, hauling goods at the docks or construction sites when large building projects were underway. Many lingered each day in hopes of being hired for short-term tasks. These day laborers lived a very precarious existence. Ancient sources and modern analyses describe a large class of underemployed poor in Rome, people with no steady income who survived on odd jobs and state charity. Even those who had a trade often earned very little as they had to compete against highly skilled laborers who were doing it for free. If so many Roman citizens had trouble finding gainful work, how did they survive? The Roman answer was the famous policy of bread and circuses. The emperors provided a grain dole, a form of public welfare, to feed the city's population, coupled with plentiful entertainment to keep people happy. By around 100 AD, about 200,000 adult male citizens in Rome were receiving free grain every month. This state-sponsored grain distribution essentially fed the poor of the capital. To put that number in perspective, 200,000 men would represent roughly 20% of Rome's total inhabitants in this period. Given that those 200,000 were generally heads of households, the grain dole supported a much larger portion of the citizen population, including their wives and children. Notably, the vast majority of citizen families needed the dole to survive. The bread was accompanied by the circuses, so to speak, and the entertainment was plentiful and free. The emperors and magistrates put on hundreds of holidays and festivals throughout the year, staging gladiator games, chariot races, theatrical shows, and more. During Emperor Claudius's reign from 41 to 54 AD, there were well over 150 days per year, classified as official holidays, when no public business was conducted. Rome's leaders were quite aware that keeping the urban populace fed and entertained was a key to maintaining order. Modern scholars interpret this as the Roman state essentially buying urban peace by subsidizing the citizens' livelihood. The grain dole and extravagant games pacified the unemployed masses, a sort of social contract where the people gave up political power in exchange for being taken care of. It was, arguably, history's first big welfare program, and it recognized that hundreds of thousands of Romans had no prospect of meaningful employment. By providing the essentials, the empire made it viable for so many citizens to remain idle, and to prevent discontent, they provided entertainment. It's important to note that even for those citizens who did have jobs, the workday was relatively short, and the tempo of work was relaxed by modern comparison. Most Romans who worked had a 6-hour workday, roughly from dawn until noon. After midday, business generally closed, and people spent the afternoons at leisure, attending baths, watching games, or resting. There was no concept of a busy 9-to-5 grind, and the culture of Rome valued leisure time. Of course, it's necessary to remember that this laid-back lifestyle was supported heavily by enslaved people performing most vital tasks in society. These slaves had horrible lives and were often worked to death in the mines or on giant farming estates. Essentially, free Roman citizens could afford to work less because enslaved workers and provincial resources propped up their urban comforts. Taking all this into account, what percentage of Rome's citizens were actually working around 100 AD? While exact figures are impossible as the Romans didn't keep labor statistics, historians have made educated estimates. Modern economic studies describe mass unemployment and underemployment in Imperial Rome as a unique phenomenon. Scholars estimate that only between 20 and 30% of adult Roman male citizens worked in what we would describe as a regular employment capacity. Including those who worked irregularly or at their leisure, this number may have been as high as 40%. Notably, even lower-class women with Roman citizenship didn't work unless it was to assist in a small family business. To put it simply, a huge percentage of Roman citizens in Rome didn't work for a living. As economic historians have noted, it wouldn't be until the 20th century that such large, totally unproductive adult male populations would be seen again. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to click that like button, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. Ivar the Boneless. The name alone is enough to spark curiosity and questions about how a fearsome Viking warlord could earn such an unusual name. Even today, over 1,000 years later, this nickname is still debated by historians and enthusiasts alike. For the Vikings, nicknames often held symbolic meanings, and Ivar's stands out as one of the most peculiar. Ivar the Boneless was a Viking leader active in the mid-9th century, known for leading invasions in England and Ireland. Norse sagas claim he was a son of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, and that his brothers included famed warriors like Björn Ironside and Sigurd Snake in the Eye. Historically, Ivar emerged in the 860s as a commander of the Great Heathen Army. The chronicles portray Ivar as a clever and ruthless strategist, a man who often outwitted his foes, despite any physical limitations his nickname implied. In 865, Ivar led a massive coalition of Norse warriors that the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle dubbed the Great Heathen Army. After landing in East Anglia, this army swept into Northumbria, capturing the city of York in 866. In 867, King Aelle of Northumbria, the monarch who, according to legend, had slain Ragnar, was defeated and slain by Ivar's forces. With Northumbria subjugated, Ivar installed a puppet ruler and turned his attention south, continuing his assault on the Anglo-Saxon petty kingdoms. Having wreaked havoc across several kingdoms, Ivar eventually left England, and by 870 or so he appears in Irish records, and he's recorded as dying in Dublin around 873. By 871, he was even being called the King of the Norsemen of all Ireland and Britain in some accounts, a testament to the breadth of his power. Ivar's campaigns left a large part of eastern England under Norse control, an area later known as the Danelaw, securing his fame as one of the most formidable Viking conquerors of his time. Why exactly was Ivar called the Boneless? The truth is murky. Notably, contemporary accounts from Ivar's lifetime don't use this nickname. It's absent in the records of his English and Irish foes. The moniker surfaces only in later Norse sagas and legends, suggesting it developed as storytellers embellished Ivar's tale. Over the years, several theories have emerged to explain this mysterious name. One explanation comes from the old sagas, and involves what some sources call a curse, and what others call a prophecy. According to the tale of Ragnar Lothbrok, Ivar's mother warned Ragnar that if they conceived a child immediately after his return from war, the baby would be under a curse. Ragnar ignored her advice in his eagerness, and as a result, their son was born with malformed bones. One account claims that in place of bones, he had only cartilage in his body, rendering his legs practically useless. Thus, from infancy, he had to be carried everywhere, and he earned the nickname Boneless to mark his condition. Yet the sagas also make clear that Ivar was extremely intelligent and charismatic, the wisest of Ragnar's sons, turning his supposed handicap into a strength. Since he had little ability to focus on single combat, he instead had the opportunity to turn himself to studying tactics and strategy, becoming a dangerous asset to the Norsemen. He was even carried into battle on a shield, directing his troops to victory despite being unable to walk on his own. Another theory is that his nickname might stem from a real medical condition. Some historians have speculated that Ivar suffered from osteogenesis imperfecta, commonly known as brittle bone disease, which would have made his limbs extremely fragile. If true, boneless would be a fairly literal description of his ailment. However, the same sources curiously note that Ivar was also tall and strong in stature, which seems contradictory if he truly had a debilitating bone disorder. This inconsistency suggests we should be cautious, and the nickname might have been exaggerated or symbolic, even if it had some basis in Ivar's health. A different interpretation is that boneless wasn't meant as an insult or diagnosis, but as a metaphor for extraordinary flexibility or agility. In Old Norse, his name can mean legless as well as boneless, which might imply he moved in an uncanny way. Viking culture often used animal comparisons for warriors, and Ivar's own brother Sigurd was nicknamed Snake in the Eye, so serpent imagery was clearly in the family. It's possible that Ivar earned the epithet by moving with snake-like speed or flow. Such a nickname could have been a tribute to his speed and dexterity in combat. In this view, rather than highlighting a weakness, boneless might have highlighted a unique strength. An intriguing scholarly theory suggests the nickname might be the result of a medieval copyist's error or misinterpretation. In Latin, the word exosus means hated or detestable. Some historians propose that he had a Latin nickname with that meaning, essentially Ivar, the really bad guy who nobody likes, which a scribe with shaky Latin misunderstood. If the scribe misread exosus as exos, without bone, they could have erroneously translated it into Old Norse. In this scenario, a clerical mistake in a manuscript could have transformed a completely different epithet into the puzzling boneless. While there's no definitive proof for this theory, it's a reminder of how easily meanings could get twisted in the age of hand-copied texts. Going against the theory is the fact that none of the Anglo-Saxon writings refer to him as the hated or the detestable. However, this could just be survivorship bias at play, since we only have a very small amount of all the works which were ever produced in that time period. A final theory posits that boneless was based on his inability to perform his masculine duties, so to speak. Some later sagas hint that Ivar showed no interest in women, or that he had no lust in him, which can be interpreted as an inability to procreate. In this crude figurative sense, calling him the boneless might have been a crude joke. If this originated as gossip among his contemporaries or enemies, it could have stuck as a not-so-flattering nickname. Another variant on this theory is that boneless did refer to a lack of ability to perform with the ladies, but that the nickname itself was ironic. In this sense, it would be like nicknaming a muscular guy Tiny or a tall guy Shorty. It would have been a joke that was understood to those under his command. They would have known that Ivar was the original Viking from Hell, and that's Hell with one L in this context. They would have known Ivar is edgy, in your face, and a Viking who gets busy consistently and thoroughly. Under this theory, Ivar was proactive with the ladies, so to speak, a fact that was lost on chroniclers recording the unusual nickname. Ultimately, we can't be sure why Ivar acquired the nickname the Boneless. No single explanation can be confirmed, and unless some specific manuscript is found, it's unlikely this will ever happen. That said, this very ambiguity has only made his legend more compelling, inviting speculation and debate through the ages. It's allowed later writers to portray him as a great tactician who commanded respect from his Viking troops with his sharp mind rather than through force. One thing is certain: more than a millennium later, people remain captivated by Ivar and his bizarre and unique moniker. One of the world's most illustrious gemstones vanished without a trace in the aftermath of the tumultuous events of the early 20th century. The Florentine diamond, a magnificent yellow diamond once prized by European royalty, enjoyed centuries of prestige before its mysterious disappearance. Its saga spans opulent Renaissance courts and the fall of empires, culminating in a baffling mystery that has intrigued historians for over 100 years. In 1918, amid the chaos of a collapsing empire, this priceless gem simply vanished, and to this day, no one knows for certain what became of it. The Florentine diamond was an extraordinary stone by any measure. It weighed approximately 137 carats and was cut with 126 facets in an intricate double rose style, giving it a light yellow sparkle with a slight greenish tint. The early history of this jewel is deeply wrapped up in contradictory legends, but all versions of events end up with an extremely wealthy and powerful Italian family acquiring it. One story claims it belonged to Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, and that he carried it with him into battle. Unfortunately for Charles, he fell at the Battle of Nancy in 1477, and according to the legend, a peasant scavenged the gem and sold it for virtually nothing. From there, the diamond found its way into the hands of the Fugger banking family, after which they're speculated to have gifted the diamond to the Medici family. Another tale suggests that the diamond arrived in Europe much later. In this version of events, a Portuguese colonial governor obtained a large yellow diamond from a local ruler in the 16th century and later sold it to the Medici family of Florence. Whatever its true origin, by the mid-17th century, the Florentine diamond was confirmed to be in Tuscany under the Medici. In 1657, a French jeweler wrote about seeing the impressive gem among the possessions of Grand Duke Ferdinando de' Medici. According to this French artisan, the Grand Duke's father, Cosimo II, had the diamond expertly cut and polished. After the Medici line died out in 1737, the Florentine diamond passed to the new rulers of Florence and then into the House of Habsburg. Francis of Lorraine, who became Holy Roman Emperor Francis I, had married Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, linking the Tuscan treasure to the Austrian imperial family. The gem was brought to Vienna and became one of the highlights of the Habsburg crown jewels on display at the Hofburg Palace. A contemporary report in 1848 described the Florentine diamond as the most splendid of the imperial gems and valued it at £100,000 at the time, an astronomical sum. The final known chapter of the Florentine diamond's known history began with the fall of the Habsburg monarchy. In late 1918, as the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed, Emperor Charles I fled into exile. The imperial family secretly took many crown jewels with them to Switzerland, including the famous Florentine diamond, hoping to keep these treasures safe. Then, at some point during this exile, the Florentine diamond vanished. The mysterious disappearance of the Florentine diamond has given rise to several theories about its fate. One prominent theory is that the exiled Habsburg family covertly sold the diamond to raise funds during their relatively impoverished years abroad. And relative poverty really is the key term here, since they still lived in extreme opulence even during these times. But considering the Habsburg Emperor Charles V was the person who was first described as possessing an empire on which the sun never sets, it was quite the reduction in wealth. Given the stone's notoriety, proponents of this idea suggest it may have been cut into smaller gems first, so that the pieces could be sold discreetly without drawing attention. An alternative theory blames theft. Perhaps an opportunistic servant or associate stole the Florentine during the chaos of exile and fled with it overseas. Rumors indeed emerged that a supposedly loyal servant of the Habsburgs absconded with the giant yellow diamond and eventually sold it in South America. Some have even speculated that the jewel might have been lost in transit or used as a bribe during the family's escape, but such claims remain unverified. Notably, while the Habsburgs were in exile, Both the Austrian and Italian governments claimed that they were the rightful owners of the diamond. The Austrian government claimed that the contents of the royal treasury were that of the Austrian state, and that the Habsburgs didn't have the right to take it. The Italians, for their part, argued that it should be returned to them on the basis that the Medicis once owned it. This Italian claim is a little bit unusual, given that the diamond was inherited by the Habsburgs after generations of intermarriage with the Medici family. However, all that is to say that the Habsburgs, at the low point of their power and influence, had two states which claimed their diamond. As such, and given that they weren't in the best financial state, it seems most likely that they either sold it or used it as collateral for a very large loan. That said, the idea that they entrusted one of their longtime servants with this task, and the servant simply ran off with it, is also possible. Over a century has now passed since the Florentine diamond was last seen, and its fate remains an unsolved mystery. Today, a replica of the diamond is available for viewing in the Palazzo Medici Museum in Florence. On a moonless night in feudal Japan, a lone figure in a black bodysuit slips over a high castle wall using climbing hooks. He melds into the darkness with such stealth that the guards who were on duty that night will later swear he must have been invisible. Moments later, a gate opens from within, flames erupt in the courtyard, and an opposing force breaches the castle without a prolonged siege. As the dust settles, whispers spread. The castle had been infiltrated by one of history's most fearsome stealth warriors, the ninja. The story of the ninja begins in an age of feudal turmoil. Scattered references to ninja-like tactics appear as early as the 12th century, noting the use of stealthy infiltrators in times of conflict. But it was during the Sengoku Jidai, the Warring States period running from 1467 to 1600, that these shadow operatives truly came into their own. In this era of incessant conflict, two rural regions in central Japan, Iga province and neighboring Koga, emerged as the cradle of professional ninja activity. From here, these ninja clans would cultivate such a dark and mysterious reputation that the basics of their lore is known worldwide centuries later. Isolated by the natural barriers of the Kii Mountains, Iga and Koga were backwaters largely ignored by the great warlords of the time. This relative independence allowed local warrior clans to govern themselves and develop unconventional tactics for survival. The people of Iga and Koga, a mix of minor samurai, village leaders, and independent farmers, formed self-defense leagues known as Iki to protect their lands from outside threats. In Iga, a confederation called the Iga Sokoku Iki united various families for mutual defense and even drafted their own rules of governance. These people didn't have the ability to fight feudal armies head-on, and by necessity became adept at irregular warfare, learning to strike from the shadows. They earned renown for skills in espionage, ambush, and infiltration, selling their services as mercenaries and spies to more powerful lords. Unlike regular samurai who fought their battles openly and wanted to see their deeds known, these operatives embraced secrecy and deception as weapons of war. It's important to note that many ninja themselves were drawn from the samurai class, putting their familiarity with weaponry to new and clever uses. By the mid-16th century, the Iga and Koga networks had established reputations as go-to specialists for covert operations. Powerful daimyo, warlords who ruled semi-independent holdings, began hiring them for missions considered too dishonorable or dangerous for regular samurai. Documents from the time, though scarce, speak of night raids and acts of sabotage carried out by these individuals. At the time, they were generally referred to as shinobi, or men of Iga or Koga, with the term ninja itself not in extensive use during the height of their power and influence. One early account from 1541 notes how the men from Iga stealthily entered Kasagi Castle during the night and set fire to the living quarters. The matter-of-fact report doesn't glamorize the attackers, but it shows that forces from Iga were feared for their ability to slip past defenses. Such incidents became more and more common as time went on. The ability of these ninja to slip past even the best defenses would eventually lead to the rumor that they had mastered the ability to turn invisible for a short time. While we can't be certain, it's likely that the ninja clans themselves didn't downplay these tales. The question of who these stealthy warriors were in reality has fascinated scholars and the general public for generations. Most ninja were born into the samurai or landowning families of their region of Iga or Koga, though surprisingly, there's even one documented case of a Chinese-born ninja. In Iga, numerous small clans and schools of ninjutsu developed, often operating independently, yet sharing common techniques. The Hattori family of Iga, for example, produced one famed shinobi leader, Hattori Hanzo, who later served the Tokugawa shogunate. Koga, by contrast, had a more centralized organization, with around 50 ninja families loosely united under one head clan in a coalition. To the samurai lords who employed them, ninja were a necessary if unsavory tool. They were useful, yet operated outside the mainstream rules of engagement. Samurai prized open bravery and direct combat. Ninja, by contrast, won battles through guile, discretion, and surprise. One might say they traded honor for effectiveness. A shinobi would accept secret pay for a successful mission rather than seek glory and spoils on the battlefield. Speaking of the rules of engagement, ninja knew that if they were caught, they could expect no mercy whatsoever. Glimpses of the ninja's own perspective come through in secret manuals of ninjutsu. The most famous, the Bansen Shukai, compiled in 1676, long after the glory days of the ninja clans, preserves the teachings of the Iga and Koga clans. It covers everything from strategy and psychology to recipes for gunpowder and medicines, counseling the would-be shinobi to be patient, cunning, and adaptable. These texts often quote Chinese military classics like Sun Tzu's Art of War, reflecting a sophisticated philosophy of irregular warfare. They detail practical techniques such as silent movement, breaking and entering, disguise, escape, and even tricks to calm guard dogs. In essence, the authentic ninja saw himself as a soldier of the shadows, one who fights unseen with intellect and stealth rather than brute strength. Ninjutsu training also had a spiritual dimension. Many ninja were influenced by the esoteric Buddhism and folk Shinto prevalent in their respective regions. Meditation, incantations, and adherence to astrological lucky days were all used to sharpen the mind and bolster confidence. By cultivating an air of mystery and mental discipline, shinobi built the inner toughness needed to operate alone at night deep in enemy territory. To remain inconspicuous during the day, shinobi relied heavily on disguise, and what we would now refer to as social engineering. The ninja might pose as peasants, monks, or traveling merchants. For instance, an enemy soldier might freely share a little bit too much information with someone he believes to be a wandering Buddhist monk or Shinto priest. Notably, part of their training included the ability to fully mimic the mannerisms of these classes of people, making the ninja a true master of deception. By night, they often wore dark clothing that blended with shadows, and if the mission called for it, would wear the pitch-black bodysuits associated with the shinobi. That said, this was mission-specific. In some cases, a ninja creeping around a castle at midnight would look, to any casual observer, like a servant. Their tools were also informed by their pragmatic approach to combat. A shinobi intending on participating in combat generally relied primarily on a katana, much like a samurai. For ranged combat, ninja would also carry bows or even firearms. The ninja also had access to a wide variety of more exotic weaponry. The kunai, which looks like a short dagger, is actually thought to be a repurposed masonry tool and could be concealed easily and passed off as a simple tool. Other weapons included farmers' sickles on chains, which again could be passed off as a tool rather than as a weapon, perfect for remaining stealthy and concealing one's power level. Ninja also had access to canes, which concealed swords, blinding powder, grenades, and even rudimentary landmines. Despite the fantastical sounding nature of some of this weaponry, this is historical reality rather than myth. It's important to emphasize that above all, ninjutsu was an art of tactics, not outright combat. Authentic ninja texts devote comparatively little time to any actual fighting techniques. This isn't to say that ninja weren't very trained and capable fighters, because they absolutely were. Rather, ninjutsu focused on fighting styles of last resort, with shinobi being assumed to already be proficient in more mainstream martial techniques. A ninja's primary weapons were stealth and information. The ideal mission was accomplished without the enemy ever knowing who or what struck them. Spying, surveillance, spreading disinformation, and sabotage were the bread and butter of the ninja's craft. Assassination missions did occur, but they were much more rare than modern myth would suggest. Instead, their successes were usually incremental and covert. Perhaps a fire was set in a storehouse, a key gate was left locked, or an enemy camp was left in disarray at a critical hour due to an infiltrator spreading a false rumor. These subtle deeds, more than any dramatic sword fight, are what gave the ninja their edge. With that said, let's discuss the peak of the era of the ninja and their subsequent fall. As mentioned, the two broad ninja clans were the Iga and the Koga. Notably, while these clans have been portrayed in fictional accounts as bitter rivals, this has little basis in reality. In fact, these two prominent ninja organizations frequently cooperated, especially when either group faced external threats. However, I said there's little basis in reality, not none, and as you'll see, the Koga actually participated in the final downfall of the Iga, though not of their own free will. The strategic location of Iga and Koga also contributed to their prominence. Nestled between the political centers of Kyoto and the territories of powerful warlords, these provinces became hotbeds of espionage. They were perfectly placed to send agents into rival domains or to offer refuge for fugitives. By the 1550s and 1560s, the ninja of Iga and Koga were at the height of their prowess. Warlords were employing them to tip the scales in battle from behind the scenes. Contemporary chronicles describe how Tokugawa Ieyasu once deployed a team of Koga shinobi to infiltrate an enemy castle, eliminate the commander, and set it ablaze. This threw the garrison into panic, allowing him to take the castle without much in the way of a conventional fight. Such tactics, repeated in conflict after conflict of the period, continued to grow the legend of the ninja. Unfortunately for the ninja clans, the independence of Iga and Koga wouldn't last forever, and they became a victim of their own outsized legendary feats. The Koga clan was defeated in 1574, with the remnants agreeing to serve the Oda clan. Notably, in 1574, there was an attempt on the life of Oda Nobunaga in this period by a sniper named Sugitani Zenjubo, who some believe to be a Koga ninja. Some have speculated that this was one of the factors which led to Nobunaga's desire for complete destruction of the ninja. The beginning of the end came in 1579, when the great unifier Nobunaga sent his son to launch a massive invasion of Iga. Contemporary historical accounts indicate that over 10,000 men were sent to accomplish this task, indicating what a threat he believed the ninja to be. In this initial invasion, the Iga forces, which included numerous ninja, managed to ambush the Oda forces, repelling them. In 1581, Oda Nobunaga himself decided to personally bring the Iga to heel, and invaded their territory with 40,000 men. Notably this time, he forced the Koga ninja to accompany his soldiers, finally severing the Iga-Koga alliance, and perhaps intending to further delegitimize the institution of the ninja. Nobunaga, who wasn't known for his forgiving nature, quickly conquered the Iga, eliminating their leadership and turning the newly conquered province into a burnt wasteland. Many shinobi were killed or scattered as Nobunaga's troops torched villages and temples. A handful of survivors fled and found refuge with Nobunaga's rival, Tokugawa Ieyasu. Ieyasu gladly took the Iga and disaffected Koga ninja under his wing, including the famed Iga clan leader Hattori Hanzo, recognizing their value. When Nobunaga was assassinated in 1582 by one of his samurai retainers, Ieyasu himself had to flee hostile territory. Tradition holds that Iga and Koga ninja guided him safely through the mountains on that desperate journey, even fending off bandits along the way. In gratitude, once Ieyasu became shogun, he employed these ninja as his guards and intelligence agents in the new regime. The elite stealth warriors had been drawn out of the shadows and into the service of a unified Japan. The life of a ninja in Edo, Japan was quite different, and they generally moved away from direct field combat roles. This was because, aside from a few exceptions early in Tokugawa rule, and when the whole thing started to collapse in the 19th century, this period was remarkably peaceful. In essence, there was no need for most of the traditional ninja duties. That said, despite this era of peace, small numbers of ninja were still employed, largely as spies, elite security guards for feudal lords, and occasionally even as hitmen. Other ninja repurposed their skills, becoming martial arts teachers, merchants, or even settling down and becoming farmers. Still other ninja ended up using their skills in a way that many unemployed low-ranking samurai did. They turned to banditry. Notably, ninja actively practiced their trade in these much reduced capacities well into the 19th century with the fall of the feudal system and the re-establishment of imperial authority. The ninja's legacy continues to captivate us. The very idea of disciplined warriors lurking in the shadows, triumphing through intellect and patience, fires the imagination. And indeed, separating myth from reality only deepens the appreciation of what these stealthy agents achieved. By tracing the ninja back to their origins in Iga and Koga, we come closer to seeing them for what they were. They weren't the supernatural assassins of myth, but pioneers of a new kind of no-holds-barred conflict, where information, technology, and stealth were the most valuable currency. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, just reminding you to click that like button, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. Also be sure to let me know if you want to hear more stories about ninja, samurai, and feudal Japan in the comments below. Now sit back as I discuss the story of one of the most famous individual ninja, a man who is widely considered to be the Japanese equivalent of Robin Hood. Imagine Kyoto in the summer of 1594. A massive iron cauldron bubbles above a roaring fire, while a crowd of onlookers watches in morbid fascination. Inside it, an infamous thief is meeting a horrific end. That thief was the legendary ninja and bandit Ishikawa Goemon, whose gruesome execution at age 36 would secure his place in Japanese legend and folklore. In the annals of Japanese folklore, few figures loom as large and enigmatic as Goemon. Often dubbed the Japanese Robin Hood, Goemon is remembered as a notorious bandit who stole from wealthy feudal lords and allegedly gave the spoils to the downtrodden. Over time, he has been portrayed as everything from a master ninja to a common thief to a righteous avenger of injustice. Yet separating fact from fiction in the saga of one of Japan's most famous ninjas of folklore is no easy task. According to popular tradition, Ishikawa Goemon was born around the mid-16th century and became a leader of bandits during Japan's tumultuous Sengoku period. The era's upheaval provided fertile ground for bandits like Goemon to thrive amid the chaos of war. The most popular origin story claims he was born to a samurai family in Iga province and learned the secret arts of ninjutsu under a famed ninja master. Another popular account suggests he was never a ninja apprentice at all, but simply a cunning commoner who turned to banditry. Despite these discrepancies, all versions agree that by the 1580s, he had organized a gang of thieves and adopted the name Ishikawa Goemon, which all stories agree was not his given name. Goemon's gang, legend says, targeted the corrupt and wealthy. By day they blended in as ordinary merchants, but by night they struck the estates of nobles with extraordinary stealth. The loot was then secretly distributed among the poor. These exploits earned Goemon a reputation as a protector of the common folk. No tale of Goemon is more iconic than his clash with Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the most powerful warlord of the day. In folk legend, Hideyoshi is cast as Goemon's ultimate adversary, a ruler who had caused him grievous harm. In some versions, Hideyoshi had captured and executed Goemon's wife, giving the outlaw a motive for revenge. In other versions, he's simply the ruler of a corrupt and oppressive system that Goemon wants to bring down. One night, Goemon supposedly crept into Hideyoshi's castle, intent on assassinating the tyrant in his sleep. He nearly succeeded, but at the crucial moment, a misstep gave him away. What actually happened varies in the telling, but what remains unchanged is that Goemon was caught before he could strike the fatal blow. Hideyoshi's retaliation was swift and brutal. A mere beheading wouldn't suffice. The captured ninja assassin was condemned to a spectacular public execution as a warning to others. In the summer of 1594, Ishikawa Goemon was boiled alive in a giant iron cauldron in Kyoto. By some accounts, Hideyoshi also had Goemon's young son tossed into the pot with him. Legend makes this grim scene into one of tragic heroism. Goemon is said to have held his child aloft above the boiling oil in a final act of protection for the weak. In this most popular telling, Goemon's extreme mental fortitude, which came from his ninja training, so impressed the authorities that they pardoned his son. As he was being boiled alive and simultaneously saving his son, he also found the energy to compose a poem. Those familiar with the story would understand that composing a final poem in death was proof that he wasn't actually a common thief, but rather definitively a samurai turned ninja. In his death poem, he cursed the powerful to forever be beset by righteous thieves, unless they stopped their corruption and adhered to the correct moral order. During the Tokugawa period, running from 1603 to 1867, Goemon was established as one of Japan's foremost folk heroes. Storytellers and dramatists embellished his saga, and kabuki theater rendered him as a larger-than-life figure. The fictionalized version of Goemon was calm, cool, and collected. He was no ordinary criminal, but a man who defied the power structure of the entire world. Naturally, most people who hear the story of Ishikawa Goemon wonder if this legendary ninja was a historical figure or not. Interestingly, while hard evidence is scarce, A few documents from the time suggest that the man behind the legend did indeed exist. A Kyoto noble's diary recorded that in 1594, some criminals were boiled alive as punishment. A few decades later, the writer Miura Joshin, who was about 30 years old in 1594, referred to a great robber named Ishikawa Gomen, who was boiled to death during Hideyoshi's rule. In 1642, the Confucian scholar Hayashi Razan published a biography of Hideyoshi that corroborated these accounts and added detail. Hayashi described Gomen as a notorious thief who broke into houses and stole and robbed without end until Hideyoshi's officers finally caught him. In this account, Gomen and many of his accomplices were then executed by boiling. This stark portrayal confirms the basic fact that Gomen was a criminal apprehended and eliminated by the state, suffering the very boiling death that looms so large in legend. Crucially, none of these early sources hints that Gomen was a ninja prodigy or a benevolent outlaw. They present him plainly as a notorious robber, not as a heroic avenger of the oppressed. The colorful elements that define the Gomen of folklore are absent from the historical record. Likewise, there's no direct evidence that he stole on behalf of the poor, or had any motive beyond personal gain, but we've got to dig deeper. However, it's necessary to analyze who these sources recording Gomen's activities were. All our sources are Kyoto aristocrats and scholars, the sort of people that the Gomen of legend viewed as appropriate targets for his fiscal liberation schemes. If this Ishikawa Gomen was simply some common thief, it begs the question, why was he boiled alive? And why did so many nobles and scholars find it necessary to write about this event? This suggests that a separate memory of Gomen may have been preserved amongst the oral histories of the people who viewed him as their champion. The poor who received the plundered wealth may have passed on their own stories of this larger-than-life ninja who had a vendetta against the rich and powerful. It may have been from these oral legends, which were never written down, that the story of Gomen's wildest deeds come down to us. And once again, I feel it's necessary to say, the treatment of him in the contemporary primary sources is very unusual if he was just some common thief. There was, almost certainly, something special about this character which alarmed the authorities to the extreme. Ishikawa Gomen's enduring fame rests on the appeal of his legend, though what we know about the historical core of that legend has likely been lost to time. A balanced view recognizes that he was likely neither the gallant ninja hero of lore nor a mere common bandit. That said, the most we can say with absolute confidence is that a thief named Gomen was executed by being boiled alive in 1594 under Hideyoshi's orders. Yet the story endures because it's a timeless tale of the underdog who defies authority. In the end, the real Ishikawa Gomen, the thief condemned by Hideyoshi, may be astonished to find out he has been immortalized as a morally upright mystical ninja assassin.